of people's lives. Nobody noticed me when I pushed my mop bucket down the hallway. Nobody looked twice when I emptied their trash cans. And nobody paused to wonder who I was beyond the faded green uniform and worn-out shoes. The building sparkled with wealth and ambition, the kind of place where suits cost more than my entire paycheck, and conversations revolved around deals worth millions. Yet there I was, hunched over a mop, scrubbing away footprints that would be replaced within minutes, cleaning smudges off doors that I was never invited to walk through. Invisible in plain sight. At first I thought the job wouldn't be so bad. After all, it was honest work. I could come in at night, keep to myself, and earn just enough to put food on the table. But over time, the weight of invisibility crushed me more than the exhaustion of my body. The laughter that passed me in the hallways wasn't shared with me. The respect that echoed in meeting rooms never reached my ears, and the only acknowledgement I received was when someone muttered about a missed spot on the floor or pointed to an overflowing bin as if I were deaf, dumb, and soulless. There were days when I longed for someone to say, "Good morning," and mean it. Not out of politeness, but because they actually saw me. But those days never came. My life was reduced to background noise, the squeak of a mop, the rattle of a cart, the faint smell of bleach. And yet, even in silence, my thoughts were loud. Every night as I scrubbed marble floors, I remembered the man I once dreamed of becoming. Years ago, before debt shackled me, I had ambitions. I wanted to open a small repair shop, a place where I could fix things with my hands, watches, radios, bicycles. My father always said I had the patience of a craftsman and the heart of an honest man. But dreams don't pay hospital bills, and when my mother's illness came, everything I saved evaporated. Then came the loans, the late fees, the spiral downward until I found myself here, a janitor in a building filled with people who never glanced down long enough to see me. I swallowed that bitterness for months, telling myself that dignity isn't measured by the work you do, but by the honesty with which you do it. Still, some nights, when I saw my reflection in the polished marble floors, I wondered if my father would even recognize the man I had become. The cruelest thing about being invisible is how it gives others the courage to mock you without fear of consequence. Some laughed when I passed by, making jokes about my uniform. Others whispered, loud enough for me to hear, that they hoped they would never fall so low. Each word felt like a pin pressed into my skin, not enough to kill me, but enough to remind me I was unwanted. And then came the day that changed everything. It was a Monday morning. One of those days when rain clung to the city and made everything smell like wet asphalt. The lobby was crowded with executives rushing in, assistants balancing coffee trays, and interns trying desperately to look important. I was there, crouched by the glass doors, wiping away muddy footprints that had tracked in from the storm. My hands were red from the cold water, and my back ached from hours of bending. I tried to stay out of everyone's way, but I wasn't invisible enough that day. The CEO himself, the man who walked through those halls like he owned the entire city, stopped near me. His shoes, black leather polished to a shine, were speckled with rain and mud. He looked down at me, not with kindness or curiosity, but with the kind of arrogance that dripped from every syllable of his voice. "Clean my shoes," he said, loud enough for the surrounding staff to hear. For a moment, the world froze. I could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on me, the mocking smirks, the stifled laughter, the disbelief that anyone would dare humiliate another man so casually. My cheeks burned, not just from the embarrassment, but from the sting of anger rising inside me. Every muscle in my body screamed to stand up, to throw the rag in his face, to walk out and never return. But anger is a dangerous master, and I had learned long ago that it rarely leads to victory. I thought of my father again, of how he once told me that a man's worth isn't determined by how he is treated, but by how he responds. Dignity, he said, is not given. It is chosen. In that moment, as the CEO stood towering over me, his eyes gleaming with power, I had to choose. Would I let humiliation break me? Or would I turn it into something else? My heart pounded, and I could almost hear the silence waiting for my reaction. The staff leaned in, hungry for the drama, ready to mock me no matter what I did. I swallowed hard, forcing my trembling hands to steady. A lifetime of struggle, disappointment, and buried pride gathered in my chest like a storm, and yet my voice came out calm. I looked up at him, forcing a faint smile, and said, "Gladly, sir." And as I reached for my rag, as the gasps and muffled laughter spread across the lobby, a strange thought whispered inside me. This isn't the end of the story. This is only the beginning. Smiled and said, "Gladly, sir." But that wasn't the end of it. Why would a man with nothing left still choose respect over rage? When my hand first touched the cold leather of his shoes, the lobby's noise seemed to fade into a dull hum, like the sound of a storm heard from far away. My reflection bent across the glossy surface, distorted and broken, reminding me of the man I had become. A janitor crouched at the feet of his master, or at least that was how he wanted it to look. My rag moved slowly, deliberately, and I knew that each stroke was not just wiping away dirt, but painting a picture for every pair of eyes fixed on me. To them, I was the perfect symbol of submission, the bottom rung of society on display. I heard their laughter, low at first, then sharper as it grew bolder. A group of interns stood by the elevator, one of them whispering loudly enough for me to hear. "Guess that's what happens when you don't dream big." Their mockery stung like a blade, and I bit the inside of my cheek to keep my anger from spilling into my expression. On the mezzanine, a few executives paused to watch, amusement flickering in their eyes, as if the free entertainment was a perk of their position. And through it all, the boss stood tall, arms crossed, smirk widening every time my rag circled across his expensive shoes. There is a humiliation that burns hot and brief, like fire licking at your skin. And then there is a humiliation that seeps into your bones like cold rain. This was the latter. It wasn't just the act of cleaning his shoes. It was the knowledge that he had orchestrated this moment, chosen it carefully, because he knew it would pierce me deepest in front of an audience. It wasn't about dirty shoes. It was about control. And yet, as I crouched there, my father's voice echoed inside me, faint but steady. I remembered the nights when he came home exhausted from the factory, grease clinging to his hands no matter how hard he scrubbed. He used to sit by the window, staring at the horizon as though searching for something he had lost. I once asked him if he hated his job, if he felt small working in a place where no one remembered his name. He smiled, tired but proud, and told me, "Son, a man is not measured by the work he does, but by how he carries himself while doing it. Pride is not in the title, it is in the heart." Those words held me upright even as I bowed my head. I wanted to throw the rag down, wanted to spit on the polished floor and walk out, but my father's lesson wrapped itself around my anger like chains. If I gave in to rage, I would only prove their point. If I endured with dignity, then no smirk, no laugh, no cruel whisper could strip me of who I was inside. Still, the battle within me raged. My mind screamed that I was degrading myself, that every wipe of the rag made me smaller, that my silence was cowardice. But my heart, guided by my father's wisdom, whispered that this was not surrender. It was survival. My hands moved as if on their own, slow and steady, turning the dull leather into a mirror that reflected back not just my bowed figure, but the strength it took to stay calm when every nerve begged me to explode. The smirks around me grew sharper. Someone snapped a photo. I heard the faint click, followed by a snicker that rippled across the lobby. That sound cut deeper than any insult. In their eyes, I was not a man anymore. I was content for their amusement, a joke to be shared later, proof of how low a human being could sink. My breath grew heavy, each inhale weighted with shame, but I forced my chest to stay steady, my hands to keep moving. The CEO leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice so only I could hear. "This is where you belong," he whispered, the venom in his tone disguised as casual superiority. His words dripped into my ears, hot and cruel, and for a fleeting moment my hand froze. The rage inside me roared so loudly I thought it would tear me apart. My grip on the rag tightened, my knuckles whitening, and in that second I pictured myself standing, meeting his smirk with my fist. But then another memory came, the day of my father's funeral. I stood alone by his grave, rain soaking my jacket, while the preacher spoke of humility and grace. I remembered how my father had lived his life, overlooked, underpaid, yet never once lowering himself to bitterness. He used to say, "We cannot control how others see us, but we can control how we carry ourselves when they look." Those words fell over me again in that lobby, silencing the rage before it could consume me. I let out a slow breath, steadied my shaking hand, and resumed polishing. I would not give him the satisfaction of seeing me lose control. If he wanted a show, then I would give him one, but not the one he expected. I polished with care, as if those shoes belonged to royalty, every circle of the rag precise, deliberate, intentional. I made the leather gleam until the lights above danced across them. Around me, the whispers lost their sharpness, fading into an uneasy murmur. Perhaps some of them began to see not a man broken, but a man unyielding. Perhaps not. It didn't matter. What mattered was that I knew. I knew I had bent without breaking. When I finally sat back on my heels, folding the rag neatly in my lap, I lifted my gaze to meet his eyes. I didn't glare. I didn't smile. I simply looked, calm and steady, daring him to see that he hadn't won. For a flicker of a moment, his smirk faltered, and I saw confusion in his eyes, confusion that the man he tried to humiliate was not shattered. But as I placed the rag back onto my cart and pushed it slowly towards the storage closet, a strange feeling crept into me, a cold ripple across my spine, like a warning I couldn't yet understand. Because this moment wasn't just about arrogance or humiliation. Something else was hidden behind it, something deeper, something that would soon unravel the fragile thread of my life in ways I couldn't imagine. The shoes gleamed like black mirrors under the lobby lights, and in their shine, I saw not just my reflection, but the shadow of what was coming. But as the shoes shined, something darker was already in motion. Sometimes the walls carry more secrets than the people inside them. By now, the humiliation of polishing my boss's shoes had burned into my memory, but so too had a strange sense awakening in me. Suddenly, those sleek hallways weren't just corridors of glass and steel. They were vessels of secrets. Words began to linger in the breaths between. Cleaning calls, whispered like tremors in the foundation of the building. And to my disbelief, even though I was invisible, I started overhearing things. It began one night, late as usual. I was emptying a recycling bin behind the executive lounge when I heard hushed voices from the meeting room, voices I didn't recognize, but tones heavy enough that they cut through the hum of air conditioning. Two men in suits, their heads bowed low, were trading numbers and accounts so fast I barely understood them, yet the words burned with implication. Offshore? Write-off? Avoid detection. My heart pounded so hard I nearly dropped the bin. I froze, silent in the doorway, hoping they hadn't noticed me. I didn't understand what they were saying, but I knew unmistakably that it wasn't about quarterly budgets or margins. Those were codes, seeds of something far darker. My throat tightened, nauseated with fear and urgent curiosity. I fled before they could turn the corner and find me eavesdropping. That night, in the darkness, Questions swirled in my mind like ghostly shapes. What was happening behind the polished boardroom doors? Was this a meeting about numbers or lies? Days afterward, I scrubbed floors in places where voices were thick. Outside director offices, around the legal department, near the shredder rooms where paper went to be erased forever. Little clues surfaced. Shredded folders left half-wiped, sealed envelopes with red tape discarded carelessly, financial charts tossed into stale bins. Over time, patterns emerged. Certain bins held papers marked Q4 reports. Others were from auditing. The trash compactor smelled stronger behind one hallway, filled with shredded pages as though they had something to hide. Each shredder-loaded bag I found made my spine tingle. My mind raced with fragmented fonts, line graphs, numbers, recyclables that became breadcrumbs. I started cataloging them silently in my head. Who always arrived late carrying a briefcase? Which entrances were locked after 6 p.m.? The routes executives always used. A maze of affiliations formed in my mind, suspect and electric. It wasn't just the documents. Sometimes the gossip seeped into trash chute talk. At the employee break room, between stealing coffee and gulping stale air, I grabbed a cup and heard them mention unreported bonuses, reallocating funds, something that'd sink us. I nearly dropped the cup in shock. One phrase floated more clearly than the rest. Burn the audit. I knew audit was legal code. To burn an audit was to destroy proof. My head reeled. But my world had taught me one hard lesson. Knowledge is a dangerous thing when you have nothing to protect yourself. If these were rumors of corruption, exposing them meant risking everything, not just my job, but my family's security. There was terror in being right, but what terrified me more was being complicit in silence. I wrestled with that at night, waking in cold sweats after dreams of suits burning and shredded papers drifting like ash around me. The corridors of the building haunted me. Every polished door and camera felt like a watching eye, a question I hadn't asked out loud. Yet I couldn't go back to oblivion, not after I had seen shadows behind the glimmer. The pieces began fitting together. The unexplained night meetings, the secretive documents, the scowling executives. With each cleaning gig in dark hours, I looked past the dust and saw coded actions, a memo left open to display compliance, but filled with false numbers. A waste bin outside the lobby with receipts that didn't match accounting logs. My cynicism, once a shield, became a tool of awareness. After 3 restless nights, I stole into the legal wing just after midnight. Only cleaning staff were supposed to be there. I entered an office left ajar, files faithfully labeled, the safe quietly locked tight. My breathing rattled as I saw folders with company letterhead buried in the trash chute. With shaking hands, I retrieved one folder labeled Unapproved Transactions. The files inside named shells, accounts, dates. My own name, including file handles like J. Carter, made me gasp. The misfiling was deliberate. It had been thrown away to avoid discovery if the wrong eyes looked. Someone inside wanted me to find it, or didn't care if it was found at all. I dropped to the floor, skimming pages. A wire transfer list, an auditor email with a red urgent, replete with an attachment I couldn't open. But Sharon from HR was acquainted. That name echoed in the hallways and in the lunchroom chatter, somewhere between compliance and betrayal. My brain felt suffocated. I clutched the folder to my chest, dizzy with what I might now be sitting on. If I acted, I might sink the entire building, professors and families alike. If I stayed silent, I would be mired in their corruption. I staggered toward the door, files pressed to my heart like an altar, freedom and fear clashing inside me. As I slipped out, the sound of the elevator doors opening made me freeze. A pair of black shoes appeared, followed by polished trousers. I ducked behind the door as footsteps echoed closer. The files trembled in my hands. I exhaled when the footsteps passed, moving deeper into the night's hush. I tucked the folder in my cleaning cart and moved faster, heart pounding louder than machinery. Polishing equipment rattled like thunder. That night, I didn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling above my bed and wondered, what story was I holding? How many lives had it already destroyed? And how many more could it ruin? But the most terrifying question remained. Was I brave enough to expose it? And then, a week later, I found a file I wasn't supposed to see. One night, I found a file I wasn't supposed to see. One wrong discovery can flip your world upside down. The evening air held a quiet that felt unnatural, as though the building itself sensed what I was about to do, and was quietly steeling itself. I wheeled my cleaning cart down the narrow corridor that led to the legal department, the nameplate blinking under the flickering fluorescent lights. My rag and spray bottle felt heavier than ever in my hands, not just from use, but from the weight of anticipation pressing against me like a smoky haze. I'd been here before, at the threshold, but tonight, something had shifted. The files that had been whispered about in the garbage bin earlier this week lay in front of me, bound in a simple gray folder stamped with "Confidential Executive Only." The letters were not only bold, but arrogant, as though daring anyone to open the folder. I scrolled through the emails that had hinted at fraudulent dealings, offshore accounts, false invoices, inflated salaries. And now those documents were here, properly filed in a file cabinet. The folder sat next to my feet, sealed, as though offering me a choice between knowledge and damnation. Inside, I saw transactions labeled consultancy expenses that didn't align with any consulting firm I could find. Wire headers sending money to accounts under aliases that didn't match client names. And the name that made my blood freeze. My father's old friend, the man who had introduced me to the idea of integrity, listed as Consultant Paid for Silence, 2023. My father, though long gone, would have blanched off his own convictions if he knew what I was facing now. My hands shook. I stepped back, away from the cabinet, breathing hard. Every step I took felt like betrayal, not just to the men who trusted me to keep their floors spotless, but to my own principles. I had always believed that if something felt wrong, it was wrong. My conscience had carried me through darker times, and as I stared at that folder, one question froze me in place. Did I report this, or stay silent to protect the fragile safety net I'd stitched together? I thought of the time I had stood up at a factory job years ago, whistleblowing a dangerous safety violation, only to lose not just my job, but my confidence as well. My supervisor's words echoed in my mind. You broke the team by caring too much. I was blacklisted after that, unable to find stable work for months, until I landed this janitorial job. Hard-won work that gave me something to believe in again. I couldn't choose to endanger myself again, not after I had clawed my way back. Still, those documents, they demanded recognition. Integrity was not just about sacrifice. It was about knowing when to fight, too. I clenched my teeth. With trembling fingers, I gripped the folder and slipped it into my cart's locked compartment. I wouldn't expose it yet. First, I needed to understand the scope of what I'd uncovered. I needed time to figure out the truth. But then I sensed something shift behind me. An almost inaudible click, as though the office door had shifted on its hinges. I froze, cart still, heart drumming in my chest. From the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A shadow submerged in darkness. I wanted to bolt, to run back through the alleys and cross the streets until I reached home. But the folder was in my cart, and knowledge was now my companion whether I wanted it or not. The next morning, the office felt the same. The coffee machines dripped, air conditioning hummed, but underneath it all, something crackled in the silence. A knowledge that I was no longer just another face in the crowd. I worked methodically, mopping floors, collecting trash. But every hallway corner felt like a hidden eye, watching whether I would stay silent or speak. Sleep eluded me that night. my mind replaying every memory I had, every betrayal and triumph that led me here, to a place where corruption outweighed innocence and fear weighed more than truth. Days passed, and I continued to gather scraps, carefully absorbing gossip, correlating names, gathering whispers. But I knew it wouldn't be enough. The folder in the cart weighed heavier each hour, and I could sense the tension coalescing around me, thick and invisible. Then came the knock on my side office door. I pushed the door open, sweater still dusted with floor residue, and looked up to see his polished shoes on display in front of me. The lines on his face were sharper than ever, his eyes colder than I remembered. He didn't speak at first, just looked up at me with an expression that held 1,000 unspoken accusations. I realized, with a shock that made my fingers go numb, that he knew. He had found out. But the boss found out, and called me into his office. When power meets truth, only one walks out unshaken. The next morning dawned with an unexpected quiet. Empty elevator shafts, silent conversations, and the soft hum of air conditioning replacing the usual rehearsed bustle of the lobby. I pushed my cleaning cart forward, weighed down by the file hidden in its locked compartment, the ledger that had already cost me sleep and trust. My heart pounded slower than yesterday, but the hurricane inside me swirled unbroken. I was halfway through polishing the glass doors to the executive suite when I felt the air shift behind me. Heavy, expectant. I turned slowly and found myself eye to eye with the boss. The same man who had watched me bow with veiled amusement, yet now looked unguarded. His gaze felt like heat hitting my skin, not from the glass I held, but from the confrontation imminent in his eyes. He didn't ask. He didn't pause. He simply motioned with a nod, and my cart trailed behind me like a guilty stain as I followed him into the elevator. The doors slid shut in a soft, mechanical hiss. Inside, the silence roared. He didn't speak until we reached the top floor, and when the doors opened, the relative brightness of the hall did little to illuminate the darkness between us. We entered his office, plush and immaculate, one corner dedicated to awards and framed accolades, the rest dominated by a gleaming mahogany desk. He gestured to a chair. "Sit," not a request but a decree. I slid onto the leather seat, hands folded awkwardly. He remained standing behind his desk, staring down at me as though measuring the weight of my worth. I tasted sweat on my lips, wondering if lingering inside me was defiance or fear, or something sharper. "I hear you've taken an interest in certain documents," he finally began, voice calm but layered. "Sad, isn't it? Something that was never meant to be found." My mouth dried. I fought to steady my nerve. "Sir, I only found what was discarded," I said, voice quiet but clear. His eyes narrowed, as if pleased by my tact. "You're a janitor," he said. "Inside these walls you're permitted to see floors, but not files. Such curiosity can be very dangerous." His tone held weight, the kind that could bend wills if wielded correctly. I swallowed. The file inside my cart flashed behind my eyelids, threatening to dominate everything I stood for. "I didn't choose to discover anything," I replied. "I didn't ask for knowledge." But once I had it, I had to choose, and I refused to ignore it. He tilted his head, eyebrows tight. "You have principles," he said quietly. "Admirable, in theory, but naive." He paused then, voice dropping lower. "I could make your life very difficult. One accusation, true or not, and your name vanishes. No career, no income, no roof. You know how tight your margins are." I felt myself flinch, not physically, but on a cellular level. He was right. My whole life balanced on fragile cords, one pull away from unraveling completely. But once again, my father's words came back, echoing across the debris of my previous existence. "Dignity is not in safety," he said. I realized then that safety was not worth living without truth. "I know," I whispered. But if that's what defending it costs me, I'm ready. He studied me for a long moment, as if daring me to hold on to that courage when darkness pressed from all sides. Then he sighed, exhaling like a match finally blown out of reach. "Very well," he said. "You've made your stand. But stand carefully." He walked around the desk, closer than comfort allowed, and put a hand on my shoulder. Gentle, but far too calculating. "You're playing a dangerous game. At least get the next move right." I nodded, voice caught. I swallowed but didn't back away. "I intend to." He released his grip, turned sharply, and walked out. The door clicked shut, leaving me gasping in the stale air of his office. I left soon after, collected my cart, made it back to the mop closet on shaky legs. The file felt like coals inside my pocket. Hot, painful, impossible to ignore. That evening I tried to sleep. I saw his smirk, heard his threat, felt the ache of sleeping rough between jobs prior to this. My jaw clenched. Courage, I realized, wasn't a shield. It was fire, dangerous, demanding. But it burned brighter than fear. As dawn broke, I returned to the building. The lobby looked the same. The cleaners swept. The suits walked hurriedly. But something had charred in the core of me, and I could never go back again. When I reached my station at the office door, where visitors expected to see a man in a uniform, not the bearer of secrets, I found a crisp envelope waiting. On my desk. My name embossed on it. Inside, words would end everything. The next morning, a termination letter was waiting on my desk. How does it feel to be punished for doing the right thing? I still remember the moment the letter landed on my desk, like a blow to the chest. The ivory envelope stark against the polished wood. My name embossed on it. My hands shook as I lifted it, each breath feeling heavier than the last. I tore it open, and the paper inside confirmed my fear. I'd been let go. Terminated. Fired. And not for incompetence, not for lateness, but for being honest. I stood in that empty office, the smell of polish lingering in the air, as the words on the page swam before my eyes. The notice explained it all in bureaucratic calm. Due to recent, irreconcilable differences, my contract is terminated as of today. No mention of my actions, the documents, the fraud, or the danger I might have prevented. Just a polite severance and a subtle reminder. Loyalty would always cost less than integrity. I grabbed my cart and walked out, head spinning, vision blurred. Everywhere I looked, people saw a janitor. Not the man who had exposed corruption, not the one who had stood without flinching when fear dragged at his backbone. Just the uniform, the rag, the invisible soul. I felt hollow, a wound left to bleed quietly by everyone's indifference. The walk home past the sleek city lights felt like a dream. I barely noticed the cars or the chatter of late commuters. Each footstep echoed in my mind. Job done, job lost, dignity intact. Or so I clung to that hope. I stumbled through my small apartment door, keys rattling in my hand, and was greeted by silence. No one asked where I'd been or what had changed. After a while, I realized there were no surprises here. My family already expected the worst. I sat at the table and watched my wife's eyes, tired, worried, heavy with unspoken fears, and in that moment, my heart burned with sorrow I couldn't speak. We had scraped together something real. No, not wealth, but just enough stability to breathe. But now, with my pay gone, all that vanished. The rent, the food, the phone bill, we'd known the day would come when our backs would crush against reality, but not like this. Not for doing what was right. That night, I replayed the face of the boss in my head. Cold, measured, resolved. The threat he had made rang louder now than it had that day in his office. I'd been warned. Step too far, and they'd wipe me away. And they had. They used their power, and I paid the price. But still, despite the fear, my heart throbbed with a strange mix of grief and relief. I had stood up. I had not betrayed myself. My wife didn't yell, she didn't cry. She just held my hand and whispered, "We'll get through this." That one phrase tasted like redemption amid ashes. Our children, asleep, never knew their father made a choice at terrible cost. This wasn't the story I'd wanted to tell them someday, but it was the truth I would bear. The next morning, newspapers in the lobby showed business headlines just as bland as ever. Stock values rising, mergers approved. Nothing about the scandal, nothing about me. I walked past them, invisible again, but this time carrying truth in my pocket, heavier than regret. With no income and few leads, I walked the streets. The city that had seemed so alive the day before now felt predatory. Every sign felt like a calculation. Who might hire a man with a record of integrity but not a resume? But I couldn't pretend I'd done wrong. I didn't hide the folder either. It stayed locked away, a silent testament to what I had refused to abandon. Days dragged into weeks, bills piled, calls went unanswered, doors stayed closed. The shame that had never crushed me in polished corridors followed me home and dripped into my sleep. Some nights I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at the dark ceiling, wanting to shrink from the world that rewarded fakery and punished truth. The pain of disillusionment was sharp, but so was the edge of my resolve. I would not lie. Not now, not ever. Yet hope remained a fragile ember. I began taking odd jobs, cleaning vacant offices late at night, stocking shelves after hours, anything to keep a roof over our heads and food on the table. My children asked me if I would go back to the place I used to work. I didn't lie. Not yet, I said, believing that honesty might one day return as value rather than liability. It was on one of those late nights, as I swept the floor of a shuttered shop, that I heard it. The faint, deliberate click of heels on the other side of the glass. My heart stuttered. Outside, standing in the dim streetlight, was a stranger with a briefcase and steady eyes. Not a mocking gaze, but something quieter, something curious. I froze, bristles stiff in my hand. The field of defeat I'd painted for myself cracked just a little, with the possibility that fate had not finished writing this chapter. Maybe honesty wouldn't banish me forever. Maybe, in some twisted way, it had set something else in motion. The world didn't end when I walked out. It changed. Darker, harder, but real. I had been punished for registering truth, but perhaps punishment was the price of all transformation. And somehow, somewhere, I still believed that fate had accounted for me, even if I did not yet understand how. But fate had already prepared an unexpected twist. What if humiliation was never punishment, but preparation? Just when I thought the courtroom was the final chapter in my story, something shifted. Not in the world around me, but in the silence that followed. The kind of silence that doesn't bring peace, but anticipation. I had given my truth, watched the man who fired me tremble behind the witness bench, and felt, maybe for the first time in years, the weight of my own worth. But that feeling hadn't settled long before my lawyer requested a private meeting. Her voice unusually careful. We met in a small legal conference room adjacent to the courthouse. The blinds were drawn halfway, and the overhead light buzzed softly, casting a pale circle over a single folder on the table. She didn't speak at first, just gestured toward the seat across from her. I sat, nerves stirring. "There's something I need you to see," she said quietly. "It came in this morning from the late founder's estate. This document was sealed decades ago and triggered for release under very specific conditions." She slid the folder across the table toward me. I opened it slowly, expecting pages of dry corporate language or property clauses that had little to do with me. But what I found was a notarized will, written in long, formal paragraphs, dated over 30 years ago. The name on it sent a chill through my spine. William H. Cartwright, the original founder of the company I had just helped dismantle from the inside. The second chill came when I saw my last name, Carter inked into a paragraph halfway down the second page. I blinked. "What is this?" I asked. She leaned forward. "This clause outlines a contingent inheritance." Cartwright included a provision that if his company was ever found to be involved in fraud or gross ethical misconduct, and if any former employee or their direct descendants played a critical role in restoring the company's integrity, the ownership rights and estate shares would pass to that descendant. I stared at her, unable to form a complete thought. "Your father," she continued, "was listed in the company's original employee ledger." He worked under Cartwright directly, as a floor supervisor and project foreman. My breath caught. I had heard my father mention a job from his younger days, some company that went big while he was still trying to survive paycheck to paycheck. But I never knew it had been here. Never knew that while I was mopping floors, I was standing where he once stood, with chalk-stained hands and calloused fingers. "This clause," she said, "was buried in a hidden section of the founder's estate plan. Your testimony, combined with the evidence you brought forward, triggered its legal conditions. Mr. Carter, you're not just a witness anymore. You are, by all definitions, the named heir to a portion of the company's founding shares, including property, assets, and partial control rights." The room spun. I gripped the edges of the table, afraid that if I let go, the moment would dissolve into air. "This has to be a mistake," I whispered. "It's not," she said. "Your father's employment was verified. His personnel file was sealed with the will. This clause was real. And it names you." I sat back in my chair, feeling the walls shift. For years, I had thought humiliation was the price I had to pay to survive. I thought being invisible was a consequence of failure. But here I was, not only being seen, but being claimed by something larger than myself. My own father, long buried and forgotten by the system, had left behind a thread, one that wrapped through time and suffering and dignity, and found its way to me. I thought about all the times I had swallowed my pride, cleaned up after executives who never learned my name, endured snide comments, cold glares, and open laughter when I bent down to shine someone else's shoes. It wasn't punishment. It was preparation. It was the universe asking, "Can you carry something greater than bitterness?" And without knowing it, I had answered yes. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" I asked, voice cracking. "Why was it hidden?" "The founder," she said, "trusted people, not systems. He believed in loyalty passed down, not bought. And he didn't want his legacy tainted by greed. He knew the world might try to bury people like your father. He left this behind for someone who would rise from beneath all that weight and still choose what's right." I couldn't hold the tears back anymore. They fell, hot and fast, not from joy or grief, but from something deeper, the feeling of being restored. I wiped my face and stared down at the will again. I thought back to the first time I cleaned the marble lobby floor, wondering if my life would ever feel like more than surviving. Now, those same marble floors might soon carry my name. As we prepared to leave the room, Janet placed a final file on top of the will. "There's one last step," she said. "You'll need to appear before the board next week. Not as a janitor, not as a witness, but as a claimant to your inheritance. I wasn't just testifying against a boss. I was claiming my birthright. When arrogance collapses, it leaves echoes in every hallway." The courtroom's decision echoed louder in my mind than the judge's gavel ever could. I sat there frozen for a moment, eyes fixed on the man who once reduced me to a rag and a bucket. The same man who had humiliated me without flinching now sat with his shoulders hunched, lips pressed tightly, and skin pale under the weight of his own downfall. The words, "guilty on all charges," hung in the air, and though I should have felt victorious, all I felt was tired. It wasn't just the verdict that silenced the room, it was the shift in power. For years, he had built a fortress of fear and control, and now that fortress was rubble. He lost his company, his reputation, and the wealth he once used to look down on the very people who kept his floors clean and his secrets buried. I had dreamed of this moment once. But standing in it didn't taste like justice. It tasted like something far more bitter. As reporters circled the steps of the courthouse and former employees whispered in tight circles, I slipped away unnoticed. The victory was public, but the pain was personal. I had told the truth and paid the price. I had lost sleep, work, friendships, and nearly my dignity along the way. Yet now, with the truth out and the lies shattered, I didn't feel powerful. I felt empty. The next morning, I returned to the company headquarters, not as a janitor, not even as a witness, but as someone who now had a rightful place at the table. The building looked the same from the outside, but something in its bones felt different. The shine on the marble floors couldn't mask the rot that had once lived here. Employees shuffled past me, avoiding eye contact, unsure whether to fear me or respect me. I wasn't one of them anymore, and yet I was. I had been asked by the board to assist in reviewing internal records, part of the ongoing restructuring process. I didn't say yes because I wanted power. I said yes because I needed closure, because the story wasn't finished yet. They gave me a temporary office, but I couldn't help myself. I found my way back to the founder's old office, once locked for decades after his death, then resealed under the former boss's reign. The door opened with a heavy creak, as though it too had been waiting for justice. The office was a museum of another era. Mahogany shelves, aged leather furniture, framed photos with names I barely recognized. Dust covered nearly everything, but something told me the room hadn't been left untouched by time alone. I wandered slowly, fingers grazing surfaces that felt familiar only through stories my father had told. He had worked here, walked these same halls, and I couldn't shake the thought that maybe he had stood in this very room. I paused at the founder's desk, still heavy with unopened drawers and yellowing paper. It felt sacred, yet unfinished. I sat in the worn leather chair and began to open drawers one by one, mostly files, old business plans, a few black and white photographs of factory floors and blueprints. But in the bottom right drawer, tucked beneath a false panel, I found something different. It was a small wooden box, locked but not sealed tight. The key was still in place. I turned it slowly and opened the lid. Inside was a journal, worn, leather-bound, and filled with ink that had faded over time. The name etched inside the cover made my hands tremble. To William Carter, for when the time is right. My father's name, written in the founder's handwriting. But what I found in the founder's office changed everything again. Sometimes the lowest step leads to the highest floor. The morning I was handed the company shares, I didn't feel like a man stepping into power. I felt like a man waking from a long, exhausting dream. The documents were crisp, legal, and clear, but my fingers trembled as I held them. Ownership. The very company where I once scrubbed toilets now bore my name across key pages. I stared at the lawyer across the table as she explained the inheritance clause again, just to be sure I wasn't imagining it. But this was no fantasy. It was real. The founder's will, my father's long-forgotten employment, the testimony I had given, all of it had conspired in silence for years to bring me to this moment. I had arrived at the highest floor, not through charm or connections, but by walking through every painful hallway of truth and humiliation. Now, the keys to the building that once held my suffering were mine. When I entered the office again, this time not as a guest, not as a witness, but as the new owner, it felt like crossing an invisible line I never thought existed for people like me. My reflection in the office window wasn't the same man who'd pushed a mop through these corridors. It was someone older, hardened, but unshaken. Someone who had learned that rising isn't always about climbing. It's often about surviving. The company board had changed. Many of the old names were gone, replaced by auditors and transition leaders. They asked me for my vision. I didn't need a consultant or strategist. I had spent years in silence, thinking about how I would run this place if anyone ever gave me a voice. Now they had. And I spoke without hesitation. I ordered internal reviews of every department with the highest priority placed on treatment of staff, especially janitors, maintenance crews, and administrative assistants. I issued anonymous surveys for every employee to share how they'd been treated and what needed to change. I banned power-based humiliation tactics and instated new HR leadership trained in conflict dignity resolution. I created a fund for whistleblower protections, knowing firsthand how lonely truth could be. One of the first things I did was walk into the break room on the lower floors, the same one I used to sit in during unpaid overtime. When I entered, a few workers looked up from their coffee, and their expressions froze in confusion. I didn't speak from a podium. I stood beside them, offered my hand, and said, "This place will never treat you the way it treated me." Word spread, not because of a press release, but because workers began to feel safe. Departments that had been silenced began to speak. There was still tension, and not everyone embraced the change. But a shift had begun, the kind that doesn't need a banner to be real. I didn't sit in the corner office much. I moved my workspace down to the 4th floor, the center of the building, where the sound of phones, shoes, and decisions created a heartbeat. I wasn't there to command. I was there to understand. One afternoon, I stood in the main lobby alone. The same marble lobby where I once knelt before my boss and cleaned his shoes while everyone laughed. I closed my eyes and remembered every crack in that floor, every stain I once wiped away while swallowing my pride. And now, as the sun poured in through the glass ceiling, I no longer felt ashamed. I felt whole. It wasn't about revenge. It was about justice wrapped in humility. The building hadn't changed. I had. And through that change, I hoped to make the building better. But just as I was settling into this new role, just as it started to feel less like a surreal gift and more like a calling, I returned to the founder's office for one last round of organizing. There, resting alone on the center of the desk, was a single envelope. It hadn't been there the day before. My name was written across it in a hand I didn't recognize. But there was one last envelope waiting for me on the desk. The greatest power isn't wealth. It's how you treat others. I opened the envelope found on the founder's desk with hands heavier than any anchor. Inside was a letter written in elegant looping script, an apology and instruction from a man long dead. The pages smelled of aged paper and unseen tears, and every word pressed into me like a heartbeat in the dark. It wasn't addressed to the board, nor to the new shareholders. It was simply addressed, James. In that letter, the founder explained that from the very beginning, he had watched my father carry himself with quiet dignity after the company prospered. He wrote that he despised arrogance and believed greatness was tested in how we treat those at the bottom of the ladder. He said that the moment I chose to respond with "Gladly, sir," a phrase meant as humiliation, I instead offered him a lesson in respect and humanity, one that mattered more than every polished office or clean corridor. Reading his words, I realized the moment I had knelt to polish up his shoes was never meant to humiliate me. It was a test, a turning point disguised in shame, and I had passed. Not because I held power, but because I held myself. Tears blurred my vision. This wasn't just inheritance, it was the transcendence of pride, the legacy of humility, and the sinew connecting my father, the founder, and me across generations. I folded the letter with care, swallowing an ache deeper than any I had ever known. For the first time, money and authority felt secondary. The real inheritance was grace. I left the office that evening and walked through the main hall, where I once bowed and was invisible. Now those floors reflected more than polished marble. They reflected hope, resilience, and the echo of integrity. Employees passed me with reverence rather than fear, whispers not of disbelief, but recognition. Overhead, the glass ceiling scattered twilight across the lobby. I thought of my father, how he taught me that respect is never given by force. It is earned by refusal to degrade yourself, even as you serve. And that lesson had altered not just my life, but the entire company. I entered the boardroom that evening, not as an owner or a victor, but as a custodian of purpose. I sat quietly, watching the faces of men and women who once judged me. My presence, once small as a mop's shadow, now carried weight not because of shares, but because it belonged to a promise kept. When they asked if anything would change, I said simply, yes. Everything I directed profits toward worker welfare programs, mental health counseling, living wages, and continuing education. I built systems that empowered employees, not silenced them. We held open forums, not because they made me look good, but because they made people matter. And slowly, the corridors filled with more voices than feet, voices that spoke, challenged, healed. Money built the company. Dignity built its future. Years later, I sat again in the founder's office and reread that letter, the moral compass he left behind. I placed it carefully in a mahogany frame, hung it in the lobby, and beneath it I inscribed one sentence: "Greatness lives in kindness." That became our guiding motto, not because it was clever, but because it was earned. And that's when I knew the story wasn't mine alone. It was a lesson for the world. If this story moved you, imagine how many others it could inspire. Don't let it end here. Like, share, and subscribe to support more stories that give voice to the unheard and dignity to the overlooked. Drop a comment. What would you have done in his place? Turn on the bell so you never miss a tale that could change how you see the world.